Over the last 3 years, energy media has done a fair amount of reporting on the Alberta oil and gas liability system, or lack of a system. This is a crisis of extreme proportions that is eventually Alberta is going to have to confront, probably Canada. And it really is severe. But on the other hand, it got me thinking about what's going on in British Columbia, especially since the province is promoting an expansion of the LNG industry. Well, Matt Simmons is a Narwhal reporter, and he has been just wrote on September 9th, who's keeping an eye on BC's oil and gas boom? Fewer people than you might think. So I reached out to him for an interview. Welcome to the interview, Matt.
Thanks for having me.
Give us an overview of your article, just the broad strokes.
Broad strokes, well, it's taking a look at the BC Energy Regulator and its role in overseeing the oil and gas sector in BC, and specifically digging into compliance and enforcement. So inspectors, what they do, how they do it, and you know, they are increasingly being given more responsibility, including over renewables. And of course, as you said, we've got this expansion of the LNG sector. So there's, more wells being drilled, pipelines being built, and of course, LNG Canada just started running. And then down south, you've got wood fiber LNG, you've got cedar LNG, siliciums. So yeah, it's a big expansion, and the energy regulator is responsible for overseeing pretty much all of it.
Let's, for folks who aren't familiar with this, let's give them a little bit of context. So, LNG Canada is the big operation on the West Coast, and it was a $40 billion project. It just started up last year, shipping LNG. There are a couple of smaller ones that you mentioned, and most of the gas for those projects comes from Northeast BC. And it's extracted there, and then it's shipped bound by pipeline down to either to to the coast, and Coastal GasLink pipeline. And then there's another one being proposed for the northern part of the province as well. Uh, is it safe to say, Matt, that the BC regulator has got operational problems? Is it doing a good job or a bad job, in your opinion?
Well, I'll take it back a little bit. So I started looking into the BC Energy Regulator and what it is doing and what it isn't doing, and its responsibilities with the pipeline that you mentioned, Coastal GasLink, which goes right through pretty much, next door to where I am here in Smithers. And of course, there was a lot of attention on Coastal GasLink as Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs opposed the project, and there were, arrests happening out on the land and whatnot. But I was seeing that there were a lot of problems with construction, and curious about who was keeping an eye on that. Like what was actually going on? I mean, this is a huge project that was 670 kilometers long, connecting to that grid up of pipelines up in the Northeast. And the new one, PRGT, that's going to be 800 kilometers long. And I live up here. It's really big. There's not a lot of people overall, so there are these vast distances that could be unchecked. And you take a bunch of guys and stick them out in the bush, and what could go wrong. So I was curious about what is actually going on. And so I submitted a bunch of Freedom of Information requests, and I started getting inspection records for Coastal GasLink. And what I was finding is in the notes section of these inspection records, which are not publicly available, inspectors were noting a lot of problems and contraventions of regulations, sometimes laws that are designed to protect water, wildlife, other values out on the land, but they weren't marking them as non-compliant. So they have this system of enforcement that they call it a graduated enforcement compliance system or something to that effect. And I wrote about that. And then I requested every single inspection record that I could get my hands on. And that took a long time, but I ended up getting 40,000 records. And so I teamed up with the Investigative Journalism Foundation, and we analyzed those records and found thousands of instances where these inspectors are sort of noting issues and saying they discussed them with the operator or the pipeline company or whomever. These are at well sites as well, and didn't mark them for non-compliance with regulations. So I reported that out. And then I took a look and I was like, how many people are there? You know, how many inspectors are there? And I found there are 17 for this entire province. So to your question about are they doing a good job or are they doing a bad job, I think more relevant is do they have capacity to handle this massive expansion in this, huge, huge place. The distances are vast. So if you're going to go in a truck, I mean, you're driving for 2 hours just to get to one well pad.
One of the criticisms that was made of the Alberta Energy Regulator is that it has been captured by industry. And of course, many of the companies that are operating in BC are actually based in Alberta. So that's the system that they would be familiar with. But it's been, instead of operating in the public interest, it operates essentially in the industry interest because it's been captured over time. And Dr. Kevin Timoney has done a lot of work on this issue with the AER, and he found essentially the same kind of bad record keeping and incomplete record keeping. And the regulator would say always, that if there was a leak, there was no observable impact on wildlife and water. And then Dr. Timoney would check the records, and they simply were incomplete. How would you tell if you don't have a record of it? And so there's a history, I think, in Alberta of the regulator simply not doing its job. And it sounds to me that what's going on in BC is at least similar.
It seems similar. And again, it comes back to capacity issues. So the BC Energy Regulator has a ton of power. They've been given all these, there are a series of MOUs, memorandums of understanding, with various ministries of, say, Environment, Ministry of Forests, Ministry of Transportation, et cetera, et cetera. And so they have powers over those pieces of legislation to make decisions. So they can permit the clearing of an archaeological site, or, for a pipeline, let's say, they can cut down the whole linear path of forest. And the BC Energy Regulator is supposed to go out and make sure that they're not doing anything wrong, like, say, cutting old growth or endangered species. And if they are, they're supposed to get fines and what have you. What I found is they're not doing that. They're not using the powers that they have to keep industry in check. And they argue that they are, but the way they're doing it is by working with industry to maintain a relationship. And so the idea of like a captured regulator is they have this intrinsic relationship. They have to work together, which is fair, but they also have a responsibility to uphold the laws that they have power over.
Again, going back to Alberta, which is what I'm most familiar with, Dr. Martin Olashinsky at the Calgary, is a law professor at the University of Calgary, has said about Alberta's regulations, its legislation, that on paper, it has very strong laws, but in the legislation, there are numerous instances where the minister, basically the department or the regulator, can exercise discretion. And this is where capture comes in, because the regulator employees work with the company all the time. And the tendency is to kind of, oh, okay, well, we'll fix it this way. And there's there's it's a very friendly relationship. And it seems like a very similar kind of process is at work with in BC.
Yeah, and I think the nature of that relationship may be somewhat functional on a small scale, but when you expand that up to hundreds, thousands of wells and these massive pipelines and export projects, that kind of relationship isn't going to hold up. The regulator has to be regulating, it has to be strict, and it has to be distanced from these companies so that the companies are held accountable for their actions on the landscape.
One of the issues that, again, in Alberta is the capacity of the regulator, not just with employees, but other things like databases. Now, this seems like a really nerdy, kind of problem that you should be easy to fix, but sources have told me that the Alberta Energy Regulator computer system is just a mess. They don't input records. They're filed on paper and they're put away in a room and never seen again. That sort of thing. And I suspect we might see the same kind of problem in BC.
I think BC is really, to give them credit, I think they're really trying to tackle that. So one of the things that came out of this reporting is we stumbled on an exemption that was granted for more than 4,000 pipelines to CNRL, which is Canadian Natural Resources Limited, one of the biggest oil and gas companies in Canada. And we were kind of shocked to see that. We are like, what the heck is this? 4,000 pipelines exemption doesn't exist. Like, we can't find any record of this apart from this little note. And so, again, we asked a bunch of questions and reported that out. And since then, the energy regulator in BC has started they added to their database. They created a public facing page to post these exemptions. I don't think they're up and live yet, but the intention is there to make more information publicly accessible. Now, all that said, it is a maze and it is incredibly difficult to find information on their website. It's there if you know what you're looking for and how to look for it and where to look for it. But I think their claims of being incredibly open and transparent and what have you kind of fall short if, it's this mess of technical data that is really incomprehensible to the average person.
Again, the parallels to Alberta are uncanny here because I've interviewed public interest lawyer Drew Uchuk, who tracks this stuff diligently, interviewed him a number of times about this very issue. And finding information on the Alberta Energy Regulator website is just a nightmare, and you really can't do it. In fact, I remember one time somebody had sent me a link to a very interesting page. I sent it to Drew, and he said, "My God, where did you get this?" I've been looking for this on the website for a long time, and I just couldn't find it. And the opaque nature of oil and gas regulation in the two provinces is a real problem. And in your opinion, do you think it's deliberate?
Hmm, that's a good question. I don't know. I really don't know. I think it has a real impact on public trust. So if the regulator is doing what it is supposed to do, which is represent the public's interest and keep watch over these companies that are operating and potentially damaging the environment and public health and safety, um, I think they need to find ways to gain that public trust. So if they are doing a good job, they should be shouting that from the rooftops and everybody should know it. It doesn't seem like they're doing that. I've talked to a number of sources who have been very frustrated with their dealings with the BC Energy Regulator, asking questions and getting the runaround, getting, Well, that's the jurisdiction of DFO, Fisheries and Oceans. And then Fisheries and Oceans says, well, that's the jurisdiction of the Environmental Assessment Office. And the Environmental Assessment Office says, oh, that's the jurisdiction of the BC Energy Regulator. And, the poor person on the other end of all that is just left confused. And in confusion, I think the natural tendency is to start being suspicious or, outright like say you are not doing a good job. And I think there's plenty of room for improvement. And again, back to that, like we are in this period here in BC of a massive, massive expansion. This is like the biggest thing that's happened in BC for a very long time. And unless the regulator, starts adding capacity and really doubling down on winning that public trust or gaining that public trust, I think they're going to be increasingly facing, they've already got a few lawsuits levied against them. There's going to be probably more of those and just a general distrust.
Matt, what is the level of public trust in British Columbia with respect to the regulator? And again, comparing it to Alberta, there have been some very high-profile leaks and other problems, which has, I think, discredited the AER, and then it's political interference and so on. So I think the AER in Alberta, my impression is it's much more visible. It's been criticized more openly, but the BC regulator appears to, for the most part, kind of operate behind the scenes. It doesn't have high public visibility. Is that a correct impression?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the average person knows next to nothing about the BC Energy Regulator, which is in part why I've been doing this reporting because it has so much power and responsibility. And I think very few people know that. And in light of more responsibility, more power, and more projects, and especially with, the BC government and the federal government moving to, quote unquote, fast track projects. People need to know. And my hope is that the BC Energy Regulator can step up and take responsibility and use the powers that it has to ensure accountability, with all these projects that do go ahead.
I want to ask you a question about liabilities, which is a huge issue in Alberta. But one of the things that gets mentioned in the AER documentation is that gas wells tend to get reclaimed sooner than oil wells because oil wells leak and contaminate the soil, and they're more expensive. So the industry tends to reclaim gas wells because they're cheaper and easier to do. Most of the wells in British Columbia are natural gas wells. So is there a liability issue of, a big inventory of wells that have not been reclaimed?
There's still a lot out there, yeah. I haven't really dug into that, so I don't have numbers or, percentages, but I think there is a similar kind of situation here where, yeah, there's a lot out there on the landscape that needs to be cleaned up that hasn't been cleaned up. And yeah, I mean, I think like in Alberta, there are some measures, again, whether or not they're enforced is the thing, like liabilities funds, orphan wells, etc. And there are companies who actively work on orphan wells and abandoned wells. But yeah, there's plenty to do still.
Matt, this has been fascinating, and it's a topic that I think we're going to be reporting on a lot more. As you know, there's just so much to do. There are a lot of stories here, and this is very much one of those journalism stories where it is in the public interest. The public needs to know this. So thank you very much for this.
Yeah, thanks for having me.